Today, we're going to do something I haven't done in public before. And no, it doesn't involve anything really embarrassing. Today, we're going to cover a subject I call the grammars. So, hi, I'm Kurt Doolittle, Dr. Brad. What do I call you? Dr. Brad? I like that.
That's fine. I've been called worse, I say, by meaner people. That's questionable.
All right, so I'm Kurt Doolittle for the Proprietarian Institute of Natural Law. Dr. Brad and he's been kind enough to help me present the content for the method. And so today's segment is on the grammars. I'm going to share my screen so you can see what that means. So now that we've applied the method to terms and types and statements and sentences, episodes and stories, we're going to apply the method to language itself. So in the stream, vocabulary, phrases and sentences, stories, grammars, and arguments, we're going to cover the grammars. And to put it in context, we're going to change how we view grammar from a statement about language independent of logic to categorizing language as a spectrum of logics. So in the outline of the content, the book, the course, we're here at the grammars at the end of part 1. And grammars in the P method. Okay. There are 5 difficult topics in the proprietarian method. We've been going through them. Disambiguation. Another one is adversarial epistemology, which we will cover later on, not today, but later on in another session. The grammars, which is what we're talking about here. Operational grammar, which is what we've been leading up toward producing. And strict formal construction, which is the application of this operational grammar. There are 3 things that aren't so difficult. They're actually pretty intuitive that you end up applying those grammars to. And that's less complicated. And it's the stuff most people find most interesting because it is how we answer the question of these moral and social questions. It's the formal logic of ethics, really. And so those are testimony, reciprocity, and demonstrated interests, or for people who followed me for a long time, we call that property in toto, which is all property or demonstrated interest. And the rest is rather easy. It's all the application of it, like cooperationism, the ternary logic of cooperation. And we're going to find that pattern of 3s of our senses is going to show up everywhere. Trifunctionalism, like always, like just as ternary logic, how the ternary logic applies to politics, and markets and everything that comes as a result, and the difference between group evolutionary strategies. And this is at all levels, sexes, classes, and civilizations, although we spend most of our effort on civilizations. So the P method changes us from using syllogisms, sets, inferences, and proofs to operations, or what we call actions. And I want to remind people that programming is a new logic, and that it's become, and it probably will continue to be, as important as understanding logic and mathematics. But if we're talking about how we're changing grammar around, what is a grammar? Well, originally it's how to write well, but it is technically it's a book of rules for an ordinary language. The discipline of linguistics might refer to ordinary language or natural language. A grammar usually consists of the study of, or the discipline of grammar, studies the phonology of sounds, how we make sounds, morphology, how we make words, the syntax, which is how we do the organization of, this is wrong on this, spelling, punctuation, and word order, grammar being more about sentences, and metaphysics being the paradigm and premises within our framework. In other words, contrary to our intuition, there are presumptions in every language. There are metaphysical biases in each language and presumptions about the world that come from the group's evolutionary strategy. We have to handle the problem of semantics, which is what's the meaning or truth, and then pragmatics, which is context. So a grammar continues all of these, but functionally, which is the second bullet point, it's a protocol for communication. It's the rules of continuous recursive disambiguation necessary for the transfer of meaning, obtaining agreement on it, and its limits or due diligence. So language consists of a stream of information, continuous recursive information, that eliminates ambiguity. So a grammar is the rules of continuous recursive disambiguation within an ordinary language. So going from originally to functionally to operationally, if we look at the operational construction of grammar, it's a protocol for a set of transactions. So we're continuing the accounting paradigm. It consists of premises and dimensions of permissible reference. The dimensions of permissible reference in fiction are different from those in math. The difference in theology are different from those in philosophy, which are different from those in the sciences. So the paradigm is included within the protocol. So we usually talk about metaphysics, semantics, and pragmatics. Most linguists don't talk about metaphysics separately from semantics. They talk about just the use of the language itself. We're not only going from semantics or meaning and context, we're saying that we're breaking this into a metaphysical presumptions. In other words, what dimensions are permissible in the first place, and within the context, like the discipline, what dimensions are possible and permissible within that context.
The impression that I get after reviewing that slide is this very interesting thing that you have done, which is you've deconstructed an interhuman communication into a very machine-like fashion, guaranteeing that I'm transmitting the information and receiving feedback that you have adequately understood the message. It's an error checking protocol, this continuous recursive disambiguation.
Correct.
And it's
so the thing is that we think this as being like machines instead of that we're making machines like us.
Right.
So we've made machines like us, and we'll get a little scary in a few slides and explain why.
The interesting function of it, though, is a very detailed picking apart of that which is generally subliminal in its function.
What I'm doing is giving us the words, which is what science does. It explains the causal properties of a paradigm within the natural hierarchy of paradigms, such that you can construct an operational logic out of it. That's the purpose of science, to produce a language that serves as a logic of a paradigm within the hierarchy of paradigm of the sciences. So what are the biological origins of grammar? Well, again, I'm going to restate this slightly differently. The grammar does refer to the rules of continuous recursive disambiguation. It's a protocol for information transfer between humans. It's not that I'm saying that humans should be like computers. I'm saying that we do this and we made computers like us. Just like when you'll see a little bit later, we make computer games, and everything in a computer game that's 3D is made out of millions of triangles that are computed by a bunch of edges we call vectors. Well, it's disturbing that the computer game works a certain way, but when you realize our brain does the same thing, we didn't invent the paradigm of 3D computer programming, 3D action games, real world modeling, and then use it as an analogy to explain ourselves. That's the only way to explain the world as it is, and it's the most efficient. So we just made 3D computer games reflect what we do. Again, phonology, which are sounds, morphology, words, consist of bodily actions. Punctuation is just a substitute for tones, pauses, and breaths. A syntax refers to the organization of the sentence, including its word order, and pragmatics refers to the method by which we use suggestion, deduction, inference, abduction, and guessing, the unstated from the stated. In other words, there are these wonderful terms in linguistics. Let's turn them into operational language, which is what I'm doing here. And semantics refers to the production of a transaction for meaning, especially that of consent and truth. So we're trying to produce consent with semantics. But what's this biological origin of our ability to organize these long streams of language into phrases, sentences, and stories? Well, I'll start with this, the upper left-hand corner, this E and the A and the little arrows between them. We call that a Markov chain in math, but it really is just a map. And it says from A, I can only go to E, and or back to A. I can only go from E, I can only go back to E or to A. And those are the weights of each of those transitions. Right underneath that is a little diagram of a hexagon.
Okay.
And it starts out with a little triangle. So if we go over to the right-hand side and we look at those little red squigglies.
Yes.
That's a path of a rat moving through a square space. Those little red dots are whenever a neuron fires in the rat's head. So this is how you and I calculate space and time, is that we have a little machine in our head that calculates our speed, direction, head direction, and turn rate, and eye direction. And it estimates size and it counts size by the space your body takes up. So these are called place cells or space cells. And we have cells in right down in here that figure out constantly where we are in relation to a location, a landmark or two, the borders, the objects, and the spaces. And we create a mental map of these spaces, which is why we have senses of recall and direction. So if you look at underneath that, there are some, right underneath the red dots, there are place cells. And these place cells are different colors. They show how different neurons fire when they're entering a known place. So underneath that illustration, you see the S shape with the rat at the top. The rat will fire different neurons at different locations. Of course, they're complex sets of neurons.
Right.
The reason we can remember things so clearly is that there's an awful lot of inhibitory neurons. And so what they do is they try to create a sparse ID for wherever we are. So that's why we can remember everything, is that we have a lot of neurons, but they produce sparse IDs, sparse firings, that tell us where and when we are in space and time. All these things come together and form an episodic memory. If you were a programmer, so you'd learn about natural keys, key substitutes or IDs, and you would learn about transactions. Well, our brain is doing that constantly, and we made computers do that because it's the logical thing to do at the least amount of cost. So the beauty of the mind is that, we do have a speedometer, we do have a step counter, and these things are approximate. They're about the size of our body. They organize into hexagons. So everywhere we go, we have a triangular relation to a hexagon that it fulfills a space approximately body or pace size. And if our brains will make these shapes fit into the shape of an odd shaped room. Funny thing, when they first started doing this, they were always using square rooms for the rats or rectangular rooms. So they're coming out with nice even hexagons. And so this woman said, have you ever tried a circle? And they came out with, it's distorted. And if you think with lots of angles, it's distorted. So your body is calculating, your brain is taking all this sensory information in together, collapsing it into an estimate of the space around you.
Right. And it's
that produces an episode, and an episode forms what causes all those things to be recalled in time together. So that's why we can reconstruct the experience of being somewhere, and an episode of memory is because that episode is the index for all our senses that are brought together in an orchestra in that moment. So we have an episode, we have location, border, space, speed, direction, turn direction, head direction, and eye direction. and we develop this mental model. Well, that's most of the work of having a brain. Your brain is trying to find a way for you to move through space in order to obtain resources. So it evolved we know how it evolved, right? That's why very simple organisms have a scent thing, then a mouth, and then it has something that lets it move. Well, that little sensory thing that said move in response to this or move in direction of the food scent, everything of the brain evolved from that. It's just motion, coordinating motion to pursue an end. So wayfinding is simply the way between you continuously recurse from one location to another, or continually move from one step to another, or one action to another.
Right.
Well, most things can't do complex. I mean, crows can do interesting tricks, apes can, but that recursive ability is really costly, and that's what we're good at. So when we think about how am I doing X, Y, or Z, it's always the same origin. We're able to wayfind increasingly complex layers of steps, predict and wayfind a series of steps. So grammar in speech is no different from me figuring out how to pour a cup of coffee. It's the same biological issue. We use wayfinding. So when we move, we wayfind. When we use sentences, we wayfind. When we tell stories, we're wayfinding. Grammar is wayfinding, and wayfinding is just continuous recursive disambiguation of state to state. So whenever we move somewhere, we create a Markov chain. We move from E to A. Then we move from E to something else, and A to something else. And we keep going, and it's how you find your way through a maze. If you were in computer science class, they teach you fairly early on to write an A search, which is how you work your way through a maze. And what most AIs do today is they figure out faster ways to get through a maze. That's the difference between you and I trying to reason something out and an AI just looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of cases that produce feedback loops so it can jump to the end of the maze because it knows it's going to go there anyway. So starting on the left, sensory stimuli has these different properties. It goes to the wayfinding facility, which is it goes to our direct attention, goes in the frontal cortex where we keep attention on it. And then we just keep our attention and wayfind our way through speech, just like we'd wayfind our way through a maze or wayfind our way back to our nest if we were a reptile.
I like this slide.
And then we're limited by the physical, behavioral, and evolutionary laws, which turn into first principles, which let us produce the deflationary grammars or let us evade them with the inflationary grammars. So those are our limits over there.
So the extreme right is what we would call the natural laws.
Mm-hmm.
That's the natural state or the order of the world, the order of the universe. Is that correct?
The laws of the universe. Yep.
There we go. I like that slide so much.
So this is just again, to go through the process, we get a sensation, we have perception. So I disambiguate sensation from perception being the world model, from auto association, which is what we auto associate from the episode we created with the world model, to attention that is won by all those parts of our brain, those 50 whatever or 80 different agents in our brain saying, hey, look at me, because that's what's going on, right? We don't imagine one thing. We imagine a whole host of competitive ideas, and the one that is most coherent or opportunistic wins.
I'm having trouble processing that word opportunistic.
We tend to favor what acquires. So what acquires is something, it varies a lot. It could be just novelty. It could be understanding. So whatever acquires more tends to get our attention. The exceptions are this dorsal. Let's say you feel pain, right? Pain works like an interrupt, which says, I get attention first. So does your consciousness. It says, I get attention. Your frontal cortex says, I'm demanding attention. And this regulates the thalamus to maintain connections that are here. And so, what's going on is we think our brain shuts off. It never shuts off. We just regulate what can get our attention. That's why we dream. It's always going. It never turns off. Why? We can't afford to have it turn off. You're in a position where, oh, wait, I got to start the car and the lion's going to eat me. Well, you're not going to wait for the car to start and warm up. You have to be able to go from resting or unconscious state to conscious state very quickly. And we can. So the brain never shuts off, it keeps going. That's why we know when people aren't here anymore, is because it's not going anymore. So there's a competitive market in our brain between predictions that seek competitively to obtain our attention. So this is why something's on the tip of our tongue, is that it elevated, but it elevated enough. We have to go back and work on it to see if we can get it enough associations so we'll be able to get our attention, because attention is saying, okay, I've got this network open. I've got the internet open from Tokyo to London, and keep it open. And so that's really what's happening. It's an economy. And I refer to it that way, as a neural economy. And neurons that get excited get fed. So if your idea competes with mine and connects for attention, it gets fed.
Right.
And so neurons starve and dendrites collapse. Neurons get fed and dendrites get fed. So dendrites spread.
That the interesting function of it in my mind is that the cortex is largely inhibitory in its function.
Correct.
And it's
trying to produce an efficient, sparse connection between the relevant sensations, the episode that contains the relevant sensations, and your frontal, your attention and emergency, your thalamus and emergency, or your frontal cortex if you're trying to figure something out.
I like this model too of opportunistic, competitive neural impulses traveling around in the brain all at the same time. And the opportunistic nature of them is, which is going to gain me the most right now. But the model it's very concise. I want you to know that I appreciate it as a piece of intellectual work to be able to state it.
Once you realize it's incredibly dumb, right? Nature nature does things with lots of numbers. It can't remember anything. So what it does is produce Markov chains. I'm going to try networks. So in our brains, it's just how many layers from the back of my brain to the front of the brain does it take for me to produce a group of recursive loops that get my attention at increasingly abstract ranges, so that I can do it. And the only thing it wins by is what acquires most. Most people know that we had a neural crest mutation that allowed us to vastly increase the number of our neurons. Most people know that. But what happened early on is the entorhinal cortex, right down at the bottom, that assembles all this stuff, is the brain doubled over, and so we got a split between the physical movement. And so if you look at the cortex, which is, it's only as thick as a dinner napkin, the same size as a dinner napkin, it's a very thin layer on top there. And in that thin layer are all these neurons, but really it's two sets of three layers. The bottom layer says, where's my body? In other words, every freaking neural column you've got knows where that piece of it is from. In other words, if the brain grows along with the body, and of course, whatever it's attached to is where the neurons go. And so it has to learn how, the brain is organized in modules that are close to each other, but it has to learn where each neuron is in relation to others. And it does that. And that disambiguates the growth of the body. And then it disambiguates how the rest of the body is related to itself. And when we're moving, the bottom part, I'm oversimplifying, the bottom set of layers say, okay, where is that? And, where is that can be entirely tiny, like the edge of this computer, right? It's almost like the whole visual thing is just to help us build space to move our body. Right. And then the thinking part's on top of it. It's probably some neurologist is going to criticize me. I'm like, dude, I'm just trying to get the general idea across. It's not like I can't go into the layer. I can go into which types of neurons are in each type layer and tell you what the layers are doing. But I know this is an excruciating detail, but no, I'm not going to go there.
It's not necessary. And it is, we'll leave the audience cold.
So there's a hierarchy, which is our context retention, or hierarchy. We have a civilizational paradigm that's buried in our ordinary language. There's a sort of logic to the ordinary language paradigm. And then we come up with a grammar vocabulary of that ordinary language. And then from that, we can create deflationary grammars from ordinary, inflationary, and deflationary grammars. But the difference is that while the ordinary languages vary quite a bit, Swahili varies a lot from Italian, and Chinese varies a lot from English or German. Are there all of those grammars, whether deflationary, going down to accounting and mathematics and logic, or inflationary, going up to magic and pseudoscience and theology, etc., mythology, the logic remains the same because the dimensions we share at each level of deflation or inflation are the same. In other words, mythology stories, the narrative tends to be constant across all human languages. Logic is constant across all human language. Math is all constant across human language. So if you go to tell stories, they're going to have archetypes and plots. Plots are just changes in state. So you're going to have up, down, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, down, up, down, right? That's all that happens. And that's what a plot is. And it's archetypes, which are archetypes reflect emotional states. And so that's what a story does. And so there's a logic to stories. That's why they all go along the same way. That's why mythologies are all about the same.
So I'm gonna ask you to disambiguate here a little bit regarding the grammars, and sure. I'm just going to restate it so that you are certain that I understand. The deflationary grammars appear to be scientific reality based, which is to say, correspondent to natural law, as opposed to inflationary grammars, which are fictions.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying not to correct you because you're right. The way I would add to that yes. is that we're removing dimensions in order to create measurements, and we're adding dimensions in order to create associations. So
okay. So
does that make sense?
Adding dimensions is inflationary?
Yes.
Okay, so please restate that. So we remove dimensions in order to create
measurements.
Measurements, okay.
In other words, to increase precision.
Okay.
And we add dimensions in order to increase association. So there's an extraordinary value to mythology because it's a system of measurement that remains constant over time. And that's the problem, is intergenerational transfer of group strategy. So mythology serves as an intertemporal. What?
That was good, man. But I can't write fast enough.
You can always just watch our video.
Mythology. I am sorry to have derailed you.
No.
Mythology is.
If you want to know it, the audience is going to want to know. So let's talk about this. This is important.
Very vital. Intergenerational transfer of
group evolutionary strategy.
This is the culture. This is culture. I mean, is that a fair name for that?
Culture is the intergenerational transfer of a group strategy by indirect means, whereas like law and science is a transfer by direct means. But it's like anything else. You can teach a kid a story or a parable pretty easily because it only appeals to archetypes. When archetypes are things we are, this is why mythology matters. Man is the measure of all things to man. So you transfer the measurements in the dumbest possible thing: imitation, sympathy, and empathy. And so the system of measurement, so the intergenerational transfer of group strategy is mythology, tradition, and norm.
But see, this is the conflict zone here. We're approaching the conflict zone where we're having, there's a society, the conflict is in this realm.
Correct. The conflict is when you mix groups with different strategies, there are a number of serious problems. The first is my strategy compatible with yours, or is it essentially warfare against yours?
Right. And that's the rub.
And the second one is my strategy suitable for my demographic and yours is for yours, and therefore we're permanently incompatible. And then you add on to that a group strategy has to suit the demographic distribution of traits in a population. And so group strategy traditions and norms evolve, and language evolve to serve the median of the distribution of any group of people.
Okay.
Yet the median of the distribution of any group of people varies a great deal between groups, at least between civilizations it does, because the civilizations roughly reflect evolutions of neoteny of mankind. So we're not different species, but we're different breeds, and this has produced different group evolutionary strategies that and group traditions and norms and laws and religions that suit the needs of a demographic distribution. In other words, if we were all 150 IQs, we would speak in much longer sentences of much greater depth, right? And we would learn very, very quickly at a very young age, and we would have very different issues from if we had a 60 IQ, which is, if you take an African pygmy, they can hunt. I mean, they have 60 IQs. I mean, an ethnic European or East Asian who has 60 IQ has a mental defect. They don't have mental defects. They don't have any personality problems. They just can't learn abstractions. So the problem is your group strategy, your mythology, your traditions, your norms, your institutions, and your language have to suit the demographic distribution. And so they do suit the demographic distribution.
So I recognize the conflict as being this is the attempt to homogenize the population within a particular civilizational evolutionary strategy that is alien to them by force.
Right. And so we could call racist, but we're the least racist people because we're the least clannish, because it's been bred out of us the longest. Then East Asians are more neotenic, right? They've evolved more, they've got longer lifespans, lower sexual maturity, bigger brains, more retention of childhood offender. They have a slight IQ, they have a 5-point IQ advantage. And what's the reason? Well, there's consequences for that are slightly different because they branched off earlier in a different group and matured farther. So there's slight variations in our behavior. But if you want to educate an East Asian person, it's way easier than educating a ethnic European, an ethnic South Eurasian, or ethnic African. It's just because why? Because their body's trying to grow faster and mature faster instead of mature more slowly and learn more slowly. So, I mean, learn more easily. So, I mean, it's just our differences, but we have these relative needs. But is it true that 115 IQ person from any group is going to fit fine? Yeah, of course. The problem isn't up there. The problem is below about 105. It increasingly gets worse because these people are more dependent on their upper classes. They're more dependent on their norms. So because they can't learn, they have to follow groups consensus. They have to follow repetition and tradition. These things provide anchoring for them. So the more adaptive you are, the less that matters. Less adaptive, the more it matters. So we put people together in groups where we have different group strategies because we have different group needs. And what we find is that we generate conflict for a whole host of reasons I won't go into here, but it's natural. And, we're more vulnerable to it because we're less clannish. And so we're less racist. So we have a higher vulnerability to it. Whereas the Chinese just tell the Uyghurs that, you're going to go away. Yada, yada, yada. I forgot where we were. So I was trying to get the point across that grammar is the logic of a paradigm, and that logic is determined by the dimensions within that paradigm. You can only do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, etc. with math. There's only so many operations. There's a very simple logic to math, right? I mean, if you get up into the narrative, there's a logic to plot archetypes and plots. And there's only so many archetypes. There's only so many plot. I mean, the argument is there's only there's 1, there's 12, or there's 30, depending on how detailed you want to get it. But reality is all people do today, which you see with like things like, what's a good example? Game of Thrones, is we're making incredibly elaborate plots with incredibly elaborate character arcs because there's only 30 plots.
Gotcha.
So that logic to the narrative is consistent across all cultures, despite the fact that all cultures use different values reflecting their group strategy attributed to it. So I can't watch Chinese movies because it seems childlike to me, right? I can watch Russian because I love it. I mean, the heart and soul in Russian movie is just awe-inspiring. They are the people that should write literature. Right. I mean, it's like Italian design. I mean, I don't know, it's like they're just great at it because there's more of it there, more people doing it, they put more value in it. And so it happens. So, I mean, the different cultures place different strategies.
Very good.
So if I got the point across that grammar is a logic within a paradigm, all grammars converge at both ends into a very similar set of logics across the spectrum, with the only difference being the valuations at the inflationary side that cause association and the lack of values at the deflationary side, which produce measurements. Association, inflationary, deflation, measurements.
Right.
Constant across civilization, in logic, variation in value. Can I go back to sharing my screen now?
Yes.
All right. I love to share. There's a thing I have about sharing. It's that, why does your wife always want to share cheesecake? I'm like, look, if I bought a cheesecake, if I'm bad enough to order cheesecake for myself, I'm not sharing the goddamn cheesecake. All right. I don't know if I need to cover this because I think I've beaten it out already. I think we've just covered this.
Okay.
So we tended to look at grammar as the description of a language, but I'm taking it down to, there are rules of this universe that are uniform across the human species, that because of our marginal indifference of our sense perception and abilities, and that there are differences in values, but basically the grammars are a set of logics across the spectrum. And while we might vary in our vocabulary and the loading and framing of that vocabulary based on it, that underneath it, the logic is consistent from deflationary to inflationary. And if we invent a new kind of accounting, that'll get added to the list.
A new kind of accounting.
Yeah, if we came up with a new kind of, I'm trying to think of something we invented programmatic logic. Okay. So logic, now the logic spectrum has a new kind of logic in it.
Okay.
If we can invent a new kind of math, it'll have a new logic in it. A new kind of accounting, it'll have a new thing. So we can expand these dimensions, yes. Right? We can expand, we can add new members to this spectrum, just like if there's colors, right? With the color spectrum, if we identify the name of a new color, Pope, we can put that new color in, but it doesn't change the logic across the spectrum.
Now I want you to draw a picture, define the relationship between the grammars and the civilizational value structures that are different.
That's coming. That'll be later on.
Okay, good. Okay.
So I'm going to show you the grammars now.
Yeah.
As long as I've got the idea that that the laws of nature are identical.
Yes.
Grammars are identical. Yes. And what changes is our level of knowledge and our valuation across it.
Yes.
All right. As long as I've got that across, that's fine.
That's good.
So this leads to why science is important, is because it's deflationary. It looks for first principles. So all language converges on science, as long as you're pursuing truth. If you start pursuing untruth, languages no longer converge on science. Ergo, postmodernism. The only point I want to make here, so grammar refers to the paradigm of the names, operations, and rules of recursive disambiguation and the logic within it that limit the consistency, correspondence, coherence, and of completeness. So we're producing a logic in every grammar. And we can mix grammars, we can overload. I can move from talking to you about in extremely parsimonious, very legal or organized prose, but if I want to make an association, I can move over to mythology. but I can go back. But we can be aware that when we're changing which grammar we're using. Anyway, so the only point I wanted to add here is that philosophy and choice is disambiguated from science truth, is disambiguated from law, which is decidability. And metaphysics now consists of the logic or science of the construction of the grammars. So metaphysics is now closed. There's either metaphysics following the same thing. Either your grammars are deflationary and true, or they're inflationary and false. They may be inflationary, false, but associative. In other words, help you make understanding, but that's what metaphysics is just grammars. I don't think I need to go over this. This just shows that we go from the human faculties to language, to phonemes, to morphemes, to paradigms, to vocabulary, and we reach ordinary language syntax, from which we then add or remove dimensions, producing paradigm, grammar, and vocabulary. So here are just a list of some of the grammars. The deflationary paradigms are the logics, the physical sciences, the evolutionary sciences, and the behavioral sciences. And the cooperative paradigms, which is the things we use for measurement, like politics and law and economics and accounting and all those things we use to cooperate. That's important because that's an outgrowth of behavioral sciences. And then there's the descriptive paradigms like recipes, protocols, procedures, and testimony. And then there's ordinary paradigms, like its written language tends to be formal, ordinary tends to be less so, and idiomatic tends to be less so. And then we have persuasive paradigm, which is how we conduct discourse and argument and polemic. We have inflationary paradigms, which we use the narrative, then we go to the fictionalisms, and then the frauds.
Okay, now I'm interested in this cooperative paradigms. It's all interhuman cooperation.
Correct. So all the stuff we use as standards of weight and measure.
Okay.
I mean, it's really, I mean, you have our language, which is in the middle, and we need deflationary grammars that help us perform calculations within our means of cooperation. So we have all these different methods. So you're going to see this all come together in a moment. So all grammars follow the same rule. I'm trying to repeat this: paradigm, logic, semantics, names, operation, the grammar and syntax, and the agreement for cooperation. So it's a protocol for communication. This is the protocol for all human communication. It's just a matter of the experience, the total experience, deflationary grammars and inflationary grammars. And then all we're doing on top of that is group strategy and values. So now we get to the next level.
I find this interesting. The part where you get the agreement at the end of it is like signing off on the transaction.
Well, that's what understanding is, right? So operationalism is the maximum level of human cognitive disambiguation. If we can't disambiguate it, we can't say we understand it. Well, that's the problem in the past, is we hit human scale and then we had to go from via positiva to via negativa. The problem is once you're beyond operationalism, you end up with things like simulations where there's neural networks. You can't figure out what the brain is doing. I mean, we know what the brain is doing, but you can't trace it. There's no way to trace what happens from this nerve to the other because it's too damn complicated. Well, it's the same thing with neural networks. Okay, now we got to make another leap.
Okay.
So we just went from a grammars consisting of the laws of the world, our ordinary language that experiences the world, deflation and inflationary, and then the values between them as what differentiates really most languages, cultures. And then we got to say, well, yeah, that's great, but let's look at what these different grammars consist of and break it down into pieces under that, and you'll start to see, I don't know if I can do this well, that how these terms that seem different in each paradigm are actually the same. So we have dimension on the left, we have dimensions like spatial dimensions, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is time, and end, which is called a manifold, right? Well, the same thing happens in geometry: points, lines, areas, right?
Right.
Surfaces, volumes, and the same thing happens in software: a value, a variable, a primitive, a custom, a property, a class, an instance, a function. The same thing happens in a database. The same thing happens in modeling, right? 3D modeling. So we have vertices and edges and faces and rows. etc. And it goes up through. And the same thing happens in cognition. Trying to point, this is where it's important, that's why it's gray, is that a sensation, an association, a sequence, a fragment, a feature, an object, a model, an entity, a prediction, a composition, an experience. It's the same thing no matter what topic we're talking about, is we're referring to a hierarchy of basic constructs that reflect the basic construct in here.
Yes, I like that.
Right. So in the same thing in language. So we go from cognition to language. We have nouns, adjectives and adverbs, verbs, phrases, reference, names, sentences, stories, and speech. And in more abstract terms, we have, language, which is a name, a feature, category, object, change, story, speech. So this, all we're doing in every paradigm is using the same thing, right? We're doing the same dimensions in every paradigm with different words. The difference between the word is to let us know there are more values, there are more dimensions available to us in ordinary language than there are in software. So all that's happening when we're always doing the exact same thing. We're talking in geometry effectively, and because that's what's in here. It's because everything is made of geometry in here. So we're saying, okay, well, we're building this thing up in geometry, and then all that matters is what dimensions can be added to it. I'm worried that I'm not getting this across.
Don't worry, man. That's wonderful.
In essence, everything's a story, and a story is just a set of transactions. I'm going to use geometry as the reality because really our brains are built to use space and motion, and everything on top of that's coloration.
I want to have an interjection here, just minor, which is I remember hearing maybe 4 or 5 years ago, people are saying something to the effect of, it looks like we're living in a simulation. And I'm like, it does look like that. And what's interesting is it looks like it's like and I'm going to expound upon it a little bit, because it's like the civilizational operating system is different. There's two of them trying to operate in the same physical space.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that I know how to kill the simulation argument. I don't know if I'm going to do it right now, but no, we're not living in a simulation.
No, I understand you. No, I just
no, I want to use it for the audience, right?
Oh,
so for the audience, we're not living in a simulation because it's not data being transferred; it's wiring. The difference is that we build a really accurate view of the world. I mean, it's terrifyingly accurate. Through a competition for coherence between neurons, right? So we build this wiring system, not information. So what wires together, because it fires together, gets our attention. And then this competition produces an absurd, which is why we can catch a fly. I mean, don't tell me the world isn't being accurately modeled. Now, the thing is, there's a difference between perception, in other words, building the world model, and prediction, which is what we do with that to associate it to all our other episodes and memories. So in that sense, depending on whether you're living in an analytic world or you're living in a more increasingly dream world or imaginary world, you perceive yourself as living in either the reality or a simulation. And yes, we mature from back to front, and yes, different people and different groups live more in simulation as their state of homeostasis than do in observation. In other words, it's just like you and I can switch context to imagine, or close our eyes and imagine very clearly. Some people are living in a world that is more imaginary and some more physical. And there's some who live in a world that it's more imaginary and emotionally loaded. So if you have you're incredibly empathic and you're emotionally oversensitive, you will increasingly live in an imaginary world. And if you're male, hyper male like me, and autistic like me, you live in a world with almost none of that. So this is why we get this huge range in behaviors. We have people who are psychotic, which is the extreme female mind, because they live in an imaginary world, because it's so intense, they can't override it. And then autistics, which live in a world where there's no interpretation at all. It's just raw data coming through uncategorized. So we all live in this somewhere on that spectrum. And so you brought up homeostasis. We regulate our body. And I tell people one of the reasons you have trouble getting fit is you've developed a habit of homeostasis at the certain energy level. And what you've got to do is develop a new homeostasis, another one, which takes a while depending on your age. Well, it's the same thing for thinking. If you spend too much time daydreaming and enough time acting, you're going to develop a homeostasis, a state of which all your episodes are built out of, all your episodes in memory are built out of a half daydream state. And so whenever you think of anything, you're simply reinforcing the daydream state. Meanwhile, if you work in engineering, you're going to reinforce the opposite. Is you're going to say, I'm not in a daydream state, I'm in a functional state, which is why I always say it's the best thing if you want to think straight is engineering or engineering or medicine, because medicine's engineering for the body. And you should study one of those things. So this is why there's variation. Human personality is that we grow different with different weights and measures as we grow. And when we learn different things, then we put different homeostatic states on us. And this is why fitness is so American lack of fitness is so bad, because we're developing the wrong homeostatic states. It produces a lot of potential for depression.
Yes. Anxiety too.
Yeah, well, anxiety is, depression is the result of exhaustion from anxiety. That clip will be so good for so many people. So it's good that we have that clip, but let's get back to what we're doing.
Yes, sir. Back to dimensions, phrases, statements, sentences, and stories.
So we're telling stories. Stories are accounting systems, and we can tell associative accounting systems or weights and measure accounting systems, right? Associative to convey meaning, deflation for due diligence, inflation for convey meaning, deflationary for precision or due diligence. So the same thing happens at this idea of this universal structure of the grammars applies to language, logic, mathematics, and rule of law. I love this slide. Some people said this is what made me understand. Let's take math for it says numbers, counting, arithmetic, mathematics, which is the logic of mathematics, geometry, calculus, algebraic geometry, statistics, and numeracy. Notice how we go from statistics to innumeracy, and from innumeracy to numerology.
Yes.
Numerology. So you go from mathematics, from counting through algebraic geometry, which is very close to the end result of math. And then you go into statistics. The purpose of statistics is to make commensurable those things that are naturally not. And then you get innumeracy, where you're just making shit up. And then you get numerology, where you make even more shit up. So numerology is basically scriptural and legal interpretation applied to math. Well, the people believe it because people are so desperate today for feeling like, they feel out of control. And they are, because their civilization's out of control because it's been undermined. So they are desperate for something to latch onto. That's why you see conspiracy theories on both sides. You have whiteness conspiracy theory on the other, and you have conservative, conspiracy theory on the other, because everybody's lost. The same process of first causes all the way up to fantasy, from identity to won't compile, to mathematics, to innumeracy, to economics, to Marxist economics, to rule of law, to organized crime. It's the same cycle of success to failure.
I love it, man. That slide is awesome. I like what I really like is fantasy won't compile, numerology, Marxist economics, and organized crime. That all fits together to me.
It's funny. I thought I wouldn't be able to get this idea across, but apparently it's working. So
right on the money.
All right. And so now this is what we end up with.
Wow.
I'm going to show you, I'm going to switch screens and show you the Excel spreadsheet. But this is the periodic table of elements for language. So what we've been talking about is to get us here. So I'm going to switch over.
This is a wonderful map.
So I'm going to see the gray in the middle ahead of you.
Yes.
That's ordinary communication. In the middle of that, it says basis. And above that, it says communication, experiences, negotiation, and at the top. So that's the middle column. That is ordinary language.
Right.
To the left is, let's look at the third row down. It's communication, and then there's actions, experiences, and loadings. Do you see the third row down?
Yes.
In the center?
Wait.
It's right here, this part.
Yes. Okay.
All right. So we are talking in terms of direct experiences when we are talking in ordinary language. And then if we go over here, we're adding loadings. In other words, we're adding dimensions.
Right.
When we go this direction, we're reducing it to some sort of actions.
Yes.
All right. So action, imagination.
Yes.
So that's what these little arrows mean.
Yes.
So this graph goes both directions.
Yes.
And I'm going to try to see if I can get one. Can I get a half of it on screen? Yes. So from communication, we go to generation 1, which is recipes, recording, reporting, the agrarian age. Then we go to and that was law, accounting, and some sort of engineering. Generation 2, we got mathematics, the ideals, the commercial age, and that led up to the age of idealism.
Wow.
Then we went to generation 3, which is the scientific and industrial age, and that got us engineering. And all right, we went to generation 4, the algorithmic age, and that got us, physical science, computer science, and cognitive science.
Right.
So that's the evolution of thought in the deflationary order.
Yes.
And this is the evolutionary thought in our inflationary order.
Wow.
So there are 3 sets of human faculties: the physical, the verbal, and the imaginary. Right.
Yes.
So that gave us the real, the ideal, and the mystical.
Right. In a
or occult
sequence.
What was the story?
In a repeating sequence.
And so in the first generation, we got language, and in the second generation, we got the fictions.
Right.
In generation 3, we added, like I said, the ideals. In generation 4, we got into the persuasion, or the dark age. Generation 5, we got into the modern age, which is, I should do it this way. We generated influence, then appealing to pretense, then appealing to authority, then appealing to consensus. Then we had generation 5, which is appealing to fictionalisms, which is to 1970. And we have generation 6, where we are now, and it's abandoning all pretense of truth. So this is the history of the development of deflationary and inflationary languages.
Wow.
And so
I'm very impressed by this. It's a fundamental understanding, boils it down to a very categorical function.
It's just an extension of the physical sciences. And so it's just the evolution of our technology of speech as measurements. I have these generations up here, right? Generation 1,
Yes.
2, 3, 4,
Yes.
5. And so we've talked about, I have some people here like Confucius did this, Archimedes, Aristotle. I haven't figured, this is a work in progress. I haven't finished all of it, but
Right.
it's enough here to get the idea. Then in the different fields, it produces the different fields that affected, where it originated, the common law, torts, record keeping, counting, measuring, math, etc. And what dimensions does it include, which is where we get complicated. And the same thing on the other side. We say, where did it come from? Pedagogy, literature, explanation, philosophy, science, literature, lying.
Right.
And what conflation of actions and experiences is going on: criticism, overloading, framing, heaping undue praise, disciplinary pretense of knowledge, etc. So you get all the lies. Likewise, what this is, remember I showed you in the previous slide those numerical dimensions of 0, 1, 2,
Yes.
3.
Yes.
This is the terms for all those grammars that make it, for each of those grammars that reflect what volition and persistence are, what equilibration is, what change is. I mean, geometry is the lowest, most reductive version that we can use to explain what we're doing. So that's it. And then, of course, you have the same thing here: noun, adjective, verbs,
Right.
action, a story, syntax, grammar, language, universal grammar, language, the human limits of thought, etc. And so this is the history of thought in all the grammars, to show everybody that it's just the same rule across both directions of deflationary and inflationary done by the generations in which we developed the technology. And the below side is here's the geometry. We're talking about the same things at each one of these grammars. We're just using different vocabulary for different paradigms. We should be able to produce AI that can talk like humans. So have I got this idea across? Have I gotten the point across that the grammars are a set of logics that have to do with the number of dimensions, and those dimensions are either associative or disambiguative,
Yes.
and inflation or deflationary, or they're just utilitarian, like formal, ordinary, or idiomatic language. And we're just telling these things in order to make a match between the number of dimensions necessary to associate something and the number of dimensions necessary to falsify something. But we're all human. So the only thing that differs is how much abstraction can you put on something when you're talking about it.
Right. How much association can it tolerate?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Have I made that point there?
I just love that map, man. That's awesome.
So that's the periodic table of the grammars. All right. So we went over that. So if I've been successful, we now understand first causes, constant relations, dimensions, terms, sentences, stories, and grammars. So we now understand the science of language. So a logic, regardless if it's a narrative or a mythology, or the logic of mathematics or logic or counting or engineering or whatever, these are just systems of measurement given different available dimensions. So the grammar is the set of rules of continuous recursive disambiguation within a paradigm. And all languages consist of sets of these measurements in the human experiential paradigm, which is our natural human grammatical facility, which is a natural outgrowth of our wayfinding, which is a natural outgrowth of movement. All subgrammars follow the same model as continuous recursive disambiguation rules. All grammars converge at the regardless of their differences in ordinary language, they converge in the deflationary spectrum. They have to, because there's fewer dimensions there. Some are more precise, like ambiguous and conflationary presumption, and some are more entertaining. Some are more persuasive. Some are more or less truthful. But the fundamental structure is the same. Grammar produces transactions for meaning within some limits of some paradigm and falsified by tests of limits to that meaning. That's the grammars.